after being on the road for a few days, and we actually have a few snowflakes here in the sunny south, so it's odd for this time of year. Anyway, while I was on the road, I was mostly giving talks and giving workshops about this very subject because it's a popular topic right now as far as selling ideas. And I think it's partly because of the economy. It becomes harder for decision makers to make decisions on ideas, but also we are competing all the time for the attention of our decision makers. And so the better we can sell ideas, the more likely we are to bring those ideas to life. So I'd like to start off by asking you to take 5 seconds and to think of a time that you had a great idea and you presented it to your boss or to your client and you had it rejected or slashed to pieces. So take a few seconds and just think of an idea when that happened. Okay, so when you walked out of the presentation room, you probably had an expression on your face that looked something like this. And do you remember what you said to yourself or to your team at that time when you walked out after having your idea rejected? After you got past your string of profanities that you either said out loud or to yourself, you probably said or thought this statement: they just don't get it. I know I've said that a lot of times, and I've had team members say that a lot of times. We present an idea and people reject it, and we say, well, they just don't get it. I try so hard and I come up with these ideas, and they just don't understand. And unfortunately, when we adopt that attitude, it comes to be us against them, or us against him or her, whomever the decision maker is. And it's tempting to embrace that attitude because, after all, like Paul Terrence once said, anytime that we have a new idea, we are a minority of one. It's our idea, and everybody else has not yet accepted it. So if we keep that attitude of being a minority of one, and if we keep it us against them, it's very unlikely that we're going to get others to champion our ideas or buy into them. So we have to have another mindset. I read several years ago a great quote from David Ogilvy, the advertising pioneer, and he said this. He says, "It's useless to be a creative, original thinker unless you can also sell what you create." And he went on to say that management cannot be expected to recognize a good idea unless it's presented to them by a good salesperson. And of course, that salesperson has to be us. Seth Godin, the marketing and branding guru, said a similar thing. He said, it's not about good ideas, it's about selling those ideas and making them happen. He says, if you're failing to get things done, it's not because your ideas suck, it's because you don't know how to sell them. So selling is really important, and it's important for us to be the salesperson for our ideas. And that's the bad news or the daunting news. But the good news is you're a natural born salesperson already. We all are. Because you intuitively knew how to sell even when you were a kid. Do you remember when you were a child and you wanted a new bike or that puppy or that trip to Disney World? You knew exactly how to go about selling your parents on that idea, didn't you? You would pick the perfect time to approach mom or dad about it. You would wait till he or she got home from work, had time to relax a bit, maybe had a few drinks, and you knew how to address their concerns and their objections. If it was a bike you wanted, then you would talk about bike safety and how responsible you would be with that bike. If it was a puppy that you wanted, you would talk about how you would feed it and walk it and train it. If it was a trip to Disney World, you'd talk about how much you wanted to be with the family and have a great time. So you all had great selling skills of timing and needs assessment and persuasion when you were a child. But, you know, as we get to be adults, somehow those skills get dulled and diluted. And sometimes we just don't apply them as well as we did even as a child. So I guess today is a call for you to bring back those selling skills and in order to bring your ideas to life. And these are really simple skills. I often say that selling isn't rocket science, it's rapport science, because it's developing a rapport and trust with our decision makers. One thing that is important to remember, that selling is a process. And just like design is a process and writing is a process, and if you're a professional golfer or a tennis player, that's a process. And if we're not professional salespeople, sometimes we don't recognize that selling is a process. It's not just a matter of going into our boss's office or going into our client's presentation room and making that pitch. It's really a process that, just like design, begins far before we actually start the design and goes through. And the selling takes place days, weeks, months, should take place, begin taking place before we actually make that final presentation. And it begins with developing trust with our decision makers. And I see 4 kind of primary factors that contribute to building trust with anybody, but particularly with our decision makers. The first one that's really important is having a track record. This means having a record of meeting commitments, meeting or exceeding expectations. And this doesn't necessarily have to take a long time. Most humans trust others until given a reason not to trust. So a lot of times this trust is ours to lose. But we have to begin getting some kind of a track record of meeting commitments and exceeding expectations. So that's the first thing is important for trust. The second one is being willing to do some self-promotion. If we are meeting commitments and we are expanding our knowledge all the time, we need to find ways to let our decision makers know that. And this may sometimes, I've often done low-key show and tell sessions after a success with an idea, and gone back and talked with the decision maker and gone over the steps that it took to get it to reality, and find other ways. Sometimes it's providing some awareness of awards that you've won or achievements that you've reached. But some appropriate self-promotion, ongoing self-promotion, is important in building trust. Positioning goes hand in hand with that. Showing confidence, showing authority, showing poise. Because what we really want to be viewed as is an advisor. And if we want to be viewed as an advisor, we have to present ourselves as an advisor. So we'll talk some more about that in a moment. But positioning ourselves is important. And the fourth one is common ground. Developing some type of common ground with that decision maker, whether it's the client, boss, whomever. A root word of communication is common. So we have to effectively communicate with our decision maker in order to earn his or her trust, and that means listening. We have to listen to our decision makers. There's a rule of thumb, a 70-30 rule of thumb in selling, saying that we should listen 70% of the time and talk 30% of the time. Now that's hard to do in a final presentation because typically we're there to present and to talk. But along the way, we need to be listening and finding out the needs, the wants, and the likes and the dislikes of our decision maker. And maybe this is about sports or movies or books or blogs that we can somehow work into the discussion of our ideas. But it's also some commonality and common agreement on a brand, on the strategy, on the objectives, and on the philosophy. And this common ground in no way means becoming a yes person or a me too person. We definitely need to have our own thoughts and opinions and express those. But there's absolutely very small chance of building trust and chemistry if there aren't some areas of common ground. So in addition to these 4 factors, another one is to involve our decision maker in our creative process. I have a friend in New York, David Schimmel. Matter of fact, Brand Muth wrote an article about David's company in New York, Branding Company, last month in How. He owns And Partners. And David tells me that he has a mantra around his office of, if they birthed it, they can't kill it. And by that, he means if a client is involved in the development of an idea, and if they have some input along the way, then they begin to develop trust, and they begin to understand the creative process, and they begin to have some measure of ownership in the idea, so that by the time David and his team get to that final presentation and make that final pitch, the decision maker is much less likely to kill the idea because he or she now has some ownership in it. They've given feedback along the way. So I strongly suggest trying to involve your manager or your client in the creative process, in the brainstorming process, in the exploration process and discovery process. Not in every stage, not in every part of it, but bringing them in at various points can definitely help get that ownership and help them see exactly what's involved in the development of an idea. And we also really need to get to know our decision makers. I know some of you are, probably many of you are in-house designers, and there's an advantage there because you see your decision makers a lot, but sometimes that familiarity of seeing your decision makers might lead you to think that you know your decision maker well enough. And in reality, because I've been in agency as well as in-house environments during my career, in reality we need to keep getting to know more and more about our decision makers along the way. So I always say, find out what your decision maker does on Saturday night. Does he or she party on Saturday night? Do they play bingo with nuns? Or do they stay home and play with the kids? Or do they go off on weekend adventures? Get to know what they do, not only in the office, but away from the office, what their personal lives are like, what they love, what they hate, what makes them laugh, what makes them cry, what makes them scream. When I was in product development and brand communications full time, we would always keep small databases on each of our clients. And we would update those on a regular basis. And I would encourage you to do that as well if you aren't already. You can do a physical one, or you can do it on the computer. But keep a small database of the personal likes and dislikes, hobby sports, heroes, who they respect, who they admire, things about their families, things about their pets. Because we found that so valuable, because we would refer to those databases whenever we begin putting together presentations. And there would always be some nugget that we could discuss or link into that would connect our concept with their wants or needs on a personal basis. So consider doing that with your clients and with your managers. Another thing that's important is to find out before you begin preparing your presentation, where your decision maker sits on what I call a buyer's bench. Uh, um, Envision a bench of any sort and see it having 5 or 6 places to sit on that bench. Unaware, aware, understand, accept, and buy. And for any presentation you give, any concept or idea that you have that you're presenting to a decision maker, he or she is sitting somewhere on one spot of that bench. Either she's totally unaware of the concept, or she's aware of it and doesn't really understand it, or maybe she understands it but she hasn't yet accepted it, or perhaps she's accepted it and all you have to do is just take her a short distance to get her to buy in on it. Quick example, since these people are sitting in front of a Starbucks, if let's say Frappuccinos, when they first came out, there might be somebody there on the left side who's totally unaware of what a Frappuccino is. So you would have some explaining to do to tell them what's in a Frappuccino, what it tastes like, so forth. Maybe like the second person there, they're aware of it, but they don't really understand it. They've heard somebody mention Frappuccinos. Maybe they understand it, but they haven't accepted the concept of actually drinking a cold beverage like that. Or maybe like the person who's off to the side, they're not only have accepted it, but they're ready to walk in and buy it. Now, small example, but this is true with any idea that you present, that the person is at one place on that bench. And so if you have an idea or a concept that's totally new to someone, you have a long way to take them to get them to buy. And it's unrealistic to expect to go into a 1-hour presentation and move them all the way down that bench. You have an educational process to do, probably offline, of talking to them, maybe sending them materials to help them move along to awareness and understanding before you make a final presentation. I think sometimes that's why we walk out empty-handed from presentations, because we walk in with the expectation of educating people and moving them down that bench in one swift move, and that rarely happens. On the other hand, if you're presenting a website design to a client and he's technologically savvy and design-oriented, he may already be sitting on the understanding or acceptance side, and all you do need is a 45-minute to 1 hour more advisory type session to get the buy-in. So this, if you will pay attention to the buyer bench before you start your presentation, it will help direct how you structure your presentation and how elaborate your content needs to be. So I've found that very helpful to use. I often say, I say the word pitch a lot. It's in the subtitle of my book, Idea Selling. Is probably throughout that book. I use it in my workshops and talks. But I'm not, I have some problems with the connotation of the word pitch, because it implies that we walk into a presentation room and just pitch or throw out our content in the direction of the decision maker and hope it sticks. And of course, that's exactly what we don't want to do. We want it to be more of a conversation. We want it to be more of an exchange of information. And we want to be able to talk with our decision maker and not at her. And that's what pitch can imply if we're not careful. So in that context, don't pitch, point. Try to think of it as pointing and focusing attention on the challenges and problems that needs to be solved, and then point the end user or other stakeholders, how you would point them toward that solution. So what we're really doing in a presentation, we're not really selling an idea when we go into a presentation. What we're really selling is value. And that's what we need to point to. The value of our idea to the decision makers and to any other shareholders that will be in benefit from the idea. So rather than pitching out the how or the mechanics of your idea, lead by pointing to the why of your idea, the cause of the problem, and then the effect that your solution will bring. And that's the really smart way for us to gain the trust and the acceptance and the buy-in of our client. So, okay, we've prepared our presentation and we're getting ready to actually present to our boss or to our client. And as any professional salesperson will tell you, timing is everything. And you know this from being a consumer. People tend to buy when they have the time and the inclination to buy. I was on the phone earlier today with a runner's world or road runner, the way you buy running shoes online or through the phone. And I was on the phone with a customer service rep, and I ordered the shoes that I ordinarily order. And before I hang up, she says, do you want me to tell you about the specials we have on the running socks that you wear? Because she had my file in front of her. And I was sort of rushed to get ready for this talk and some other things. So I said, no, I've got to go. And after I hung up the phone, I thought, you know, I really could use some socks, but the time just wasn't right. If she'd caught me on another day, it would have been fine. And this is the same thing with us. Timing is so important. And just because we're ready to present our idea does not mean that our decision maker is ready to hear about our idea. And I think too often we get enthusiastic about our idea, and we get passionate about it, and we've worked on it for so long, so we want to rush in and present it. And this is particularly hazardous when we are in-house because the decision makers are usually right there. And it may be absolutely the wrong time, so pay attention to timing, because if your decision maker has her mind on next year's budget plan or major project rollout or department overhaul, anything, she's not going to be focused on your idea or very likely in the mood to approve it. So test the waters before you present, and ask her when would be a good time to present, or work behind the scenes with her administrative assistant or whomever to find out what the schedule looked like, because timing could very well be the deal maker or the deal breaker. So definitely don't overlook its value. And of course, for any presentation, practice, practice, practice. There's a huge difference between knowing your content and practicing it. There's a difference between studying your content and practicing it. It's important to physically deliver your presentation in advance to yourself and to others. I do a lot of presentation coaching, and of course I speak a lot on creativity and other topics, and so I'm around public speakers a lot, and to a person they rehearse and practice a lot. And if you want your presentations to be polished and professional and natural, practice will help. So please get in the habit of practicing, and if you're working with a team, practice together so you know who's going to say what and who's going to answer questions. I also wanted to say a quick word about handouts. I'm against them. I never have been in favor of handouts, and in my career I've rarely used handouts. I use them for my workshops and for some of the talks I give now, but for idea pitches and for client presentations, I rarely, if ever, have used handouts, because the reason is if you give copy of your handouts to decision makers in advance, and if you have most or all of your presentation in those handouts, you're asking for trouble, because you will totally lose their attention. When you're on page 1, they'll be on page 6. And by the time you get to page 6, they probably skimmed the entire handouts and are checking their cell phones or thinking about what they want for lunch. So I try to avoid handouts almost always, and I would encourage you to as well. Instead, prepare compelling and comprehensive leave-behinds or takeaways. Tell the decision makers before you start that in lieu of handouts, you'll be, when the session is over or when the presentation is over, you'll be given comprehensive takeaways, and that they can just sit back and relax and enjoy the presentation and not have to worry about taking notes. Almost always they'll be receptive to this, and it will definitely help your case. And put some resources, time and as much money as you can into your takeaways. Make them as compelling as possible, because if you are successful in selling your idea to your decision maker, then he or she quite likely will have to sell the idea to their decision maker. And so they can use your takeaway, your leave behind, to help sell your idea to their boss. And even if it's a CEO, he or she probably has to sell it to a board of directors. So put as much in there, put the bells and whistles in the leave behind so that they have a good tool to sell with. So I want to leave you with 5 tips to help you prepare and deliver a successful presentation. The first one is have one theme. Have one theme. Develop a presentation that's focused totally on the challenge that's in front of you and your solution, your idea. Too often when we're getting ready for a presentation, the first thing we ask ourselves is, what do I want to say? And probably a better question is, what do I want to have happen? Sure, you want to sell the idea, but how do you really see that happening? And if you know that, if you can really think about that and decide what you want to have happen and the end that you have in mind, then you'll better know what you want to say. Walt Disney was a cartoonist first and foremost, and when people would come in and pitch to him, he would always say, what's the end frame? Because in a comic strip, the payoff is always the final frame. And so know what the end frame is of your presentation. Know what the payoff is, and head straight in that direction as you're preparing your presentation. Also, be careful because the creative process is very chaotic. It doesn't go in a straight line, and it doesn't stay in line, and so it's very chaotic a lot of the times. And too often we'll try to present our idea the same way we developed it. And instead, we need to make our idea more linear. Pitching is a lot like storytelling, and it should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it should be delivered in a linear fashion. A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D, and so forth. Because remember, a lot of your clients are left-brained, and they strongly respond to a linear pattern. So make sure that you've taken the idea and transferred it into a more linear pattern. That's step one. Step two, have a strong start. Remember, your decision maker is probably all over the place when he or she comes in to the presentation room or when you come into their office. They're either thinking about the meeting they had before you arrived, or they're thinking about the meeting they have after you leave, or they're thinking about anything, maybe something at home. And so it's important that you get their attention with a strong start. Now, you can have some chit-chat before, and that will help build some chemistry, but when you actually start your presentation, know exactly what your first line or your first few sentences are going to be. There are dozens of ways to start a presentation. Let me give you 3 that are very popular and that I talk about a lot in my workshops, and ones that I've used frequently, and maybe you can borrow from those. The first one is tell a story. Tell a quick interesting story that relates to your idea, and ideally a personal story, something about you, something that episode maybe that happened to you. If you're getting ready to talk about an idea where you're helping your decision maker's brand not get lost in a maze of information and marketplace clutter, maybe you could say, I want to start by telling you a 2-minute story about the time I lost my car in the airport parking lot. You tell a quick, clever story, funny story about that, and then you segue right into your presentation. Everybody likes to hear personal stories as long as they're kept concise and as long as they relate to what is being talked about. So that's one way, is tell a quick story. Another is to ask a question. Ask a question that relates, again, to your solution or maybe to the research that you've done, that shines a spotlight on some research that you've done. And let the decision maker answer and then tie into that. And then a third way is with a quote. And I don't mean getting your dusty old Bartley's quotation book out and quoting Ben Franklin. I mean some kind of quote that's contemporary and maybe from a leader that you know the decision maker admires. And here again, that goes back to your database and goes back to your research. So maybe quote, and of course it should relate somehow to the idea that you're getting ready to present. But an even better quote would be to quote the decision maker themselves. Maybe something they've said to a group, maybe something they've said to you, maybe something they've written about. People love to hear their own words played back to them. So use this technique, just make sure it supports your solution. The third tip, use simple language. Make sure your language, not simple-minded, but simple. Make sure it connects with the language and with the mindset of your decision maker. Don't use design terminology if he or she's not familiar with design terminology or any other concept that they might not understand. Here again, talk with your decision maker, not at him. And also keep your content as concise as you can. You know, when the Gettysburg Cemetery was dedicated in 1863, they asked two people to speak. They asked a famous orator of the time, Edward Everett, to speak, and they also asked President Lincoln to speak. Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours and 13,500 words. Abe Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes and 272 words, and guess which one we remember and talk about. So keep it concise. Once you put your presentation together, go back through it, cut out the fat and keep the muscle. I've given probably hundreds of idea pitches in my career, and I've never had a client when I've got through say, I wish you had talked longer, and I doubt if you have either. So make sure your presentation is concise as you can. Also, be careful that you never have a slide or a poster or a board that looks like this, and as most of your designers, I'm sure you want, but please make sure that you don't. A good slide is like a magazine ad or like a billboard. The viewer should be able to grasp it in just a few quick seconds. You notice that most of my slides are images, maybe a word or two on them. If you have to stop and read your slide to an audience, you have the wrong slide. So keep it down to something that can be quickly grasped. Number 4, paint pictures. Paint pictures. Plant images in the minds of your decision makers. And you'll be doing it with the visuals that you have, but make sure your words paint pictures as well. Go back and read or watch on YouTube some of the speeches that Martin Luther King made, because he was a genius at painting pictures with his words. He said things like, lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, and the crooked places will be made straight. And with Dr. King's words, we don't just hear, we also see, because he's planting images in our heads. Now, most of us we'll never be orators like Martin Luther King, but we can definitely paint pictures with our words. So try to do that when you're putting together your presentation. Make sure you're planning images. And then also help clients visualize your idea as reality. You're bringing your idea in and you're talking about it in that room, but make sure you're also talking about it as to how it's going to be helping people out in the world, whoever the end users are. When I was putting together my book Idea Selling, I talked to B.J. Stout at Pentagram, and he told me about when he and Michael Baruch were doing a branding campaign for Lexington, Kentucky. And the idea that they had was to take, of course, Lexington, Kentucky is thoroughbred racing horses country, and so they took a painting that was very popular. Edward Troy, the English painter, who painted lots of thoroughbreds, and this is a well-known painting in Kentucky. And they took that painting and they made it blue. And so they came in and they made their presentation to the city council and others involved, and they said it was a gasp when they showed this blue horse. It was heresy to tamper with Troy's paintings as they had done. But then they began to show the applications for the blue horse on billboards and in guidebooks and even as a gateway, and even somebody dressed in a blue horse costume to go into schools. And soon, when they started talking about it in the real world, these buttoned-down city council members got excited and started throwing out ideas themselves of how it could be used. And they knew they had them then, because whenever you can get your decision maker participating in the idea, you know they're on board. So be sure to talk about how your idea will be in the real world. And then tip number 5 that relates to that is add drama. Add drama. As we've already said, a good pitch involves the tools and the techniques of good storytelling. And every good story has some element of drama to it. Now, a lot of times when I suggest in my workshops that you need to add drama, I see some cringes on the faces of some of the participants, because I guess they think I'm talking about dressing up in funny costumes or having marching bands come in or laser shows, and they're thinking about their conservative decision makers. But what I'm suggesting is a measure of drama that's appropriate for your client, whomever that is. And even if you have a hard-nosed, buttoned-down client, you still need some touch of drama, because drama provides emotion. And emotion contributes to decision making. Now, psychologists no longer believe that decision making is pure reasoning, because it's through emotion that we assign value to things, and without value we can't make decisions. So figure out some bit of drama that will tug at the hearts and at the feelings of your decision makers, and go for it. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It certainly doesn't have to be expensive. But do something, because nobody's ever been bored into buying anything. People like to get excited. People like to get enthusiastic, even if they're bean counters. They have an element of emotion there that needs to be touched. And again, it doesn't have to be expensive. Do you remember when Steve Jobs introduced that MacBook Air, that thin, light MacBook, back in, I think it was 2008, 2009. What he did is he walked out with a plain manila envelope, and he slowly pulled the MacBook Air out of it. And with that simple act, he dramatically revealed the size and the appeal of the MacBook Air. It probably cost him 10 cents for that envelope, and it took 5 seconds to do, and I can't imagine even the most conservative client thinking that that would be too much showbiz or took too much time. So even doing something like that can be a drama. So think about what you can do to reveal the idea and to demonstrate its value with a touch of drama. So those are the 5 tips. Have one theme, start strongly, use simple language, paint pictures, add drama. I also want to give you one tool for dealing with objections, because you're going to get objections. Hopefully you won't have a client that has this drastic of a reaction to your ideas, but you will get some pushback. on your ideas. And so rather than going into a presentation, crossing your fingers and hoping that objections don't occur, assume they will and prepare for them. And one tool that I've used for years, I call a missile defense system. And it's a really simple way to defend your ideas against what I call the missiles, the objections that are going to come your way. And all you have to do is take a sheet of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, draw a vertical line down the center, put missile on one side, defense on the right column, and then go down the missile side and write down every objection you think can possibly be made to the idea that you're about to present. Do it by yourself, do it with your team, but come up with as many as you can, and keep going until you can't think of any more objections that could possibly be raised. And then once you have those, and it may take 2, 3, 4, 5 sheets to do it, then go back and write down what your defense will be to each one of those objections, how you will respond. If you can't respond to one and you don't have a defense, then you have a hole in your idea and you need to go back to the drawing board. But assuming you have a defense for every objection, you will go into the presentation with so much more confidence. And you'll be able to also work some of those defenses into your presentation, what I call a pre-buttal rather than a rebuttal. And so it will help make your presentation even stronger. So try that, test the efficacy of that, and I'd love to hear what some of you have to say after you've tried it. So if you use all those tools, then you will hopefully sell your idea. And one piece of advice there is once you've sold the idea to your decision maker, please stop talking. Don't keep talking, because if you do, before you know it, they'll buy back your idea. They'll decide there's something else that they need to ask you about. So say thank you and wrap up, and then make sure you follow up. And there are lots of stages to follow up, but follow up is almost as important as timing, maybe more important than timing for selling. While you're still in the room, talk with the decision maker about what the next step should be. As soon as you leave the room, get by yourself or with your team and do a quick download. Write down what went right, what went wrong, and what needs to happen next. Don't take another project on. Don't go have lunch. Do this while it's top of head. Make sure you get everything down immediately. Then that same day, send a message, probably an email these days in most cases, to your decision maker, thanking her for her time and for her feedback, and whether you got the idea approved or not. Make it short and sweet, and then let her know when you will be sending a summary and other components. And then meet that commitment, send that summary on time, make sure it includes timeline, making sure it includes action steps, and make sure you answer any questions that you were unable to answer in the presentation. So hopefully all these steps will help. And in closing, I come back to Steve Jobs one more time, because he was known as a great presenter. And part of the reason for his success in presenting was because of all his passion and enthusiasm that he displayed for every Apple product. And he wasn't a stand on top of the table kind of a presenter. He was relatively calm, but he showed passion. And I've heard passion defined as not the quantity of emotion, but the quality of commitment. And if you can show the quality of commitment you have for your idea, it'll be contagious. One of my mentors is the sales guru, Brian Tracy, who's been a professional salesperson and teacher for years. And he says that selling is a transfer of enthusiasm. I love that, a transfer of enthusiasm, because if you're enthusiastic about your idea, that enthusiasm will transfer to your decision maker. If you aren't enthusiastic, you can't in any way expect your decision maker to muster up much enthusiasm. So make sure you're sold on your idea before you go in there. and make sure you let it be shown that you're excited about it. In his commencement address, the famous commencement address Jobs gave at Stanford in 2005, he talked about being fired from Apple in 1985 and then coming back in 1996. And he said in that talk at Stanford that the firing was the best thing that had ever happened to him because he came back with the lightness of a beginner, the lightness of a beginner. And that's what we need every time we present ideas, because sometimes that's difficult because we've been living with that idea a long time, doing this development, and a lot of times we're pitching to clients or to bosses that we've presented to time and time before. But for each presentation, we need to step back and present with that lightness of a beginner and remember that this is the first time they've seen the final idea. And so we need to get mentally ready the same way that the theater actors prepare themselves for each performance, even though they've said the same lines over and over again. And if you do that, if you have enthusiasm, if you get to know your audience, get to know your decision maker, if you know your content and practice it, and if you know how to enthusiastically connect with that decision makers, I promise you'll sell more ideas as you go forward, and I would love to hear from you. Thanks for being with me today. There are a lot of ways to get in touch with me, and I would love to get some feedback from you in days, weeks going forward, and we'll be happy to answer any questions at that time. And Sarah, now I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Sam. That was great. We actually have about 10 minutes left, so if you'd like to ask Sam a question, just type it in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. And actually, here's one to get us started. Sam, do you have any advice to help out with decision makers who are too preoccupied with pinching pennies all the time?
Well, I think that, yeah, I've had my share of experience with that. And you have to look at the personality and the wants and needs of every decision maker. And if they are the type that are interested in return on investment, then you've got to always talk about value. You've got to talk about the benefits of that idea. And you've got to make sure on the front end that they understand. We have to communicate back to our decision makers. This goes back to developing trust, that we understand expenses. I think we get hard knocks sometimes as creative people that we aren't aware of cost and we don't pay attention to budgets. And I've found that if I let my decision makers know on the front end that I am concerned about the budget, and if I can justify the return on investment, then they will be much more likely to buy in the end. But there's no replacement. There's no magic wand that's going to suddenly make somebody who is a penny pincher or who is primarily concerned about return on investment. There's no magic wand that's going to stop them from being that way. What we have to do is to communicate with them that we understand that and that our idea and our solutions can provide the value that will allow the expense that we want to have.
What if you have a client who's always playing devil's advocate and looking for what's wrong with an idea, no matter what it is? Any advice there?
I have a real hard time with devil's advocates because somehow they think by calling themselves devil's advocates, they put on this cloak that allows them to kill every idea that comes forward. And so what I have found, and I've had those with outside clients when I was in an agency situation, I've certainly had it time and time again with product managers and other internal clients. And what I've found helpful was to do some preliminary one-on-one work with them, and to take them through the creative process and let them know what's involved in developing the idea, and sit down with them, and when they throw out what will be a devil's advocate comment, I ask a question back to them. If they say, well, my mother wouldn't like that color, I would ask, well, what color would your mother like, or why wouldn't she like it? And then I would go back and keep asking questions so they start digging deeper into what the thinking is behind it. So the combination of them better understanding the creative process as well as that use of asking questions can help. One thing we did, sometimes we had a situation where we had one client in particular who was really a devil's advocate, and he would always, it would usually be a group of 3 or 4 people that we would be presenting to at once, and he would always be the one saying, well, I don't like that, or I don't like this, or whatever. And so what we would start doing, we would go into the presentation room in advance, and it was a conference room, conference table with chairs around it. And we would go in and we would dress one of the chairs as the end user. If it was something for a skateboard age kid, then if whatever we were designing, then we would have a jersey on the chair and maybe a skateboard. If it was something for older end user, a grandmother, we would be very stereotyped. Maybe we'd put a shawl on it, a purse, a big purse or whatever. And we would have that there when they would come into the room. Just sort of, we would make a notice of it at all. And then when it got to the point where, and it was usually that same person, when he would say, well, I don't like that, we would smile and say, yeah, but you're not the customer. There's the customer sitting over there. And we would point to that chair. And the first time we did it, everybody laughed, and he laughed as well. But it made a point. It made a point that, hey, you're not the end user in this situation, and we need to focus on who is the end user. And from then on, we did it a couple more times. And he got away when he walked in the room, he would look for the dressed chair. So I guess there are a lot. What I'm saying is there are a lot of techniques you can use, but don't wilt away from be the advocate of your ideas, and don't let the devil's advocate take charge.
Do you have any advice on indecisive clients, those who approve something, then unapprove them, and then ask you to start over?
Usually
anything you can do to nail them down?
Yeah, usually that means that they aren't confident in themselves a lot of times, or they need reassurance. I had a CEO that I worked with who was that way. I mean, he could be really strong on financial type decisions or on manufacturing decisions, but when it came to creative decisions, product decisions, those types of things, it was out of his comfort zone. So he was very insecure, and so he would say yes one day, and then he would have buyer's remorse and call me and change his mind, or sometimes change his mind before he even got out of the building. And so I found I had to really work hard on reassuring him as we went through that this would not rock, even if it was a radical idea that was going to make a lot of significant changes. I would let him know exactly how it was going to affect, be it the customers or if it was employees or whomever. I would always make sure that my presentation included how we were going to help to provide feedback or information to employees, how we were going to educate them, how we were going to make it work with our end users. So it's a reassurance job. A lot of times you have to view that person as someone who in that particular situation is insecure. And so ask yourself, how can I make this person feel safe? How can I make them feel safe for this idea? Because every decision has risk involved. It means letting go of one thing in order to grab hold of another. And so how do it's a risk reduction process a lot of times. Creative people are more used to taking risks than a lot of left-brain people are in many cases. So recognize that. Recognize they're not as willing to take risks, particularly not in the creative arena.
Here's another one. Are you an advocate of presenting a few ideas from which the decision makers can choose, or do you think it's better to go in with one strong idea?
Depends totally on the project, and I've done and the client. I've done it all different ways. It's hard to just make. I interviewed a lot of people on that topic in my book when I was writing Idea Selling. I interviewed a lot of people about that, and there was no consensus. Sometimes they said essentially the same thing. It has to depend on the idea itself. As whether you have one or more. And I asked how many, if you do have one or more than one, what's the optimum number? And again, there was no consensus on that as either, but 3 seemed to be the most common response, is to have 3 ideas. If you're going
3 is
in,
always the magic number, huh?
yeah. If you're going in with more than one, let's say you're going in with 2 just for purposes of discussion, and you have one idea, let's say, that's pretty close to what is fairly safe and is pretty close to what the decision maker you think that they would buy into, and then you've got one that's a stretch. It still meets objective, and it should, but it goes farther. It's certainly more radical. Always show the safe idea first, because that way the decision maker, if you show the radical idea first, then they get nervous and you may lose it totally. If you show the safe idea first, you say, okay, we brought in 2 or 3 ideas here, and we like all of them. We're willing to go with all of them. We back all of them. We think they all meet the objectives. We think they would all provide a solution to this problem or this challenge. But we have what I want. Let me show you one. You show the first idea, and that's the safe one. And so he or she says, "Great, this is exactly what I asked for." And so they buy into that one, and you say, "Fine, we like that too, and we'd certainly be willing to go with it." But we have another idea that extends or expands on that solution. And that's a key word there, that it extends on it. And then you show the more radical idea. And so by that time, they've already bought into one idea. They're comfortable. They feel good about it. And more times than not, when I've done that, I've had the decision maker say, you know what, that still meets objectives, but it's a stronger idea than this other idea. So show your safe idea first, and then show your more radical.
Interesting. Well, actually, I think that's all the time we have, but you have Sam's Twitter handle and email there if you have any feedback or additional questions for him. And Sam, I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and I want to thank all of our attendees for your participation today.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for joining in.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
Bye.
Bye.